worshiped before you came here? Either this morning or throughout the week. We hope that worship is not just a Sunday morning thing. We've been talking about it as a lifestyle, as a mindset. And what we talked about last week, sometimes it's good to kind of review or at least think about it, because anytime we hear God's word, he expects a response. He expects obedience. He expects us to act on what we know. And sometimes we know way more than what we're doing. And so when we think about worship, and even what we talked about last week, hopefully you remembered some things. Any comments from last week? Any applying what you heard? And this is not just a memory quiz, because we're not just here for information. Yes, Tim.
Well, I think it was the lesson last week helped me throughout the week to know or think about more about worship, even at work. You know, I'm sitting there whistling, and as I thought about different things, I mean, it's hard to see some of the stuff I was working on, because, you know, I get pretty emotional at times, you know. But the other night when we had that board meeting, and we got to pray with one of the individuals in our congregation that was going through some rough stuff. And to feel God's presence here, and to hear others praising God, to me that was worship.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? Any new insights or good reminders? Sometimes we're not necessarily learning new information, but just hearing it again, maybe in a different way, helps us to think about it in a different way or to apply it. Anyone else? Okay, well, how many of you like popcorn? I know my mom loves popcorn. And you've probably heard of popcorn testimonies where people just kind of pop up spontaneously and give a few words. And you've maybe even heard of popcorn prayer, where the same kind of thing, you know, many people just kind of spontaneously do one little word or two. So as we think of worship, what word comes to your mind? Just a whole bunch of you. Praise, okay?
Praying.
Praying, okay?
God's presence.
Presence, okay? God's presence.
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving.
Singing.
Singing. Openness. Ooh, I gotta remember that because. Okay, anyone else? Confession. Fellowship. Anyone think of adoration? Do you remember what worship means? Yes, it's worth it. Yeah, the worthiness is certainly there. Do you remember? Pardon? Bow down. That's right. We don't often think of that when we think of worship. All these other words come to mind, but we don't often think about bowing down. And I am really thankful for our Free Methodist tradition where we have an altar where we can come and kneel. There's something about getting on your knees, and I know the older we get, the harder that is. Betty's nodding. Maybe it's harder to get up. It's not so bad getting down, but it's the getting up that's hard. But there's something humbling about getting on our knees or bowing down. And how many of us bow down like prostrate? You see Muslims where they bow down supposedly 5 times a day for prayer. And it doesn't matter who's watching or what else is happening, they bow down. Now, I don't know their hearts and what's happening, but what if we had 5 calls to prayer, and every time you heard a trumpet call at work or wherever you were, well, if you were driving, I really wouldn't want you to bow down right then, but what if we had some triggers like that that would help us to remember to worship at work or wherever we are? Sometimes Christian radio helps if we're hearing Christian songs. Tim, were you about to say something? You were.
I'm just agreeing
You're just nodding, okay. As long as you don't nod off in sleep.
I didn't work last night, so I'm.
Okay, all right, you're good. I hope you brought your Bibles. If not, you can use a pew Bible. We're going to be looking at several passages of Scripture, and we're going to kind of start at the beginning. Well, no, actually, I want to work on this first, because some of the words that you use didn't start with these letters, but if we were going to put some words to each one of the letters of worship, some of them we might have mentioned. Lonnie mentioned worthy. Any other W's?
Worship.
Well, yes. That's what we're spelling. Wonderful. And you know what I like about the wonderful word is, I wrote up that, is that it's full of wonder. And when you worship, we should have that sense of awe, just be overwhelmed and completely emptied of ourselves. So wonderful. Anything else? I'm going to put it that way.
Willing.
Ooh, I like that one too. Okay. All right. Jan, you mentioned something that started with O.
Openness.
Openness. Offering. We talked about that last week, where we present our bodies as a living sacrifice. We're offering it to God.
Ongoing.
Oh, I like that one too. How about obedience?
How about if we have the opportunity to worship? There you go.
Ooh, okay. We're not gonna balance these out. I'm just gonna take them as they come.
How about often?
Oh, I like that one too. I had thought of only because when we're worshiping God, it's exclusive. We worship only God because He is the only God. Okay, let's go on to R, otherwise I'll run out of room. Pardon? Oh, witness, okay. I can do that. All right, let's go on to R.
Reflect.
Left.
Remember,
Reverence.
Respect.
All right, this minute reference.
resolution.
All right, just a minute. I'm running out of room.
You didn't think you had such good students.
No, I have great students here. Okay, let's go on to S.
Sincere,
Self-evaluate.
Salvation.
Hold on. All right, just a minute. Wait, no, shorthand starts with S. All right, scripture.
Salvation.
Someone said something self-evaluation.
Self-evaluate.
and it's sincere.
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, that's what we talked about last week, didn't we? How about submissive? Or submit? Or surrender? They're about the same. Okay, how about H?
Holy.
Holy. Or holiness, either one.
Honesty.
Honesty. Yes, holy and holiness. would start with a W. I like the answer. We don't want it wholly with whole of it. Okay, we'll put it up here. How about humble or humility?
Happy.
Habit. How about a holy habit?
Happy.
Oh, happy, I thought you said habit. Well, happy goes. Heartfelt. Okay. Well, let's just put heart for now. Okay, let's go to I.
Inspiration?
I like two words. I'll write down one. Inspiring and inspired. Inspired means that the Holy Spirit is working in us, and if it is inspiring to us, then we feel uplifted. So, inspiration.
Inspiration.
Intimate. Yes, very good. One I talked about last week when Paul was urging us. Remember? It's important. And what about P?
Praise.
Praise and prayer. What was that? Peace.
Purpose.
Pleasing and purpose. My writing's getting worse as I get to the bottom. And when you talk about purpose, you can talk about purposeful too. Passion. Passion. Well, this is a very good flash. You thought of way more than I did. But it just kind of helps us to realize that there are many aspects to worship. And sometimes we just get kind of narrow-minded or narrow-focused, and we think, well, worship is singing, and worship is praise. And that's all we think about. But there's a lot of things involved with worship, and that's why we're going to use our Bibles, and we're going to look at many scriptures. But when we look back to the beginning, man was created in the context of worship. He was created in God's image to have fellowship with him. God is holy, and until sin entered the world, man was perfect, and they had this holy relationship. They had a perfect environment. They were naked but not ashamed, and I think that's emotionally as well as physically. And they were walking with God in the garden, that sweet communion. And God gave them a holy work to do. And this is interesting. You might not know this, but the word where God tells Adam to tend the garden, the only other place it's used is in Leviticus, where the Levites are tending to the ministry of the Lord. And so when you think about the Garden of Eden like a sanctuary, like a temple, because that was where God was going to dwell with his people. That was where he was going to be worshipped. So Adam had responsibility as far as taking care of the plants and the animals and that kind of thing. But it was more than just gardening. There was a spiritual aspect to the work because it was the environment where God would dwell with his people. So Adam is basically acting like a priest, okay? Now you might not have thought of that. So they have this perfect environment of worship and intimacy, but sin changed all that. Man's perfect relationship with God was broken, and yet God had a solution, and he knew he was going to rebuild it before they even sinned. And it really is a worship matter because Adam and Eve chose to worship Satan or themselves more than they chose to worship God. And what was the result?
Sin.
Yes, and
Separation.
sin and separation, their disobedience and rebellion brought guilt and shame and fear and grief and separation. And there was pain in productivity. For Adam, it was his work with the ground. For woman, it was in childbearing. The ground was cursed. Their work was no longer a service to the Lord, but it was toilsome. There was enmity between the seed of the woman and Satan. So we got two kingdoms in conflict right from the beginning. So when we look at worship, last week we talked about, hey, why don't you hand those out? So last week we talked about worship always includes sacrifice. So when we get to Adam and Eve and we see that sin ruined worship, worship requires dealing with sin. And I think that's one of the blanks.
Janet,
Yes,
in that word, the worship with the I, can you put I am in there?
I thought of that too, good. I'll squeeze it in, the great I am. We need to know who we are worshiping and who God is and what he has done. All right, would someone read the very first verse, not in the text, but that's printed on your sheet? And not everybody has it yet, but maybe someone up here at the front could read that verse from Hebrews.
Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire.
Okay. Why don't we, if you have a pen, you will need a pen or a pencil because we'll be filling in some blanks and we will be writing some things down. Circle how we should worship God. There's a couple of things. And we want our worship to be acceptable, so obviously there must be an unacceptable way, and that's basically what our lesson is about this morning. But what do you come up with as far as circling how we should worship?
Reverence and awe.
Reverence and awe, there's one more. Thankful. Okay, so this is the heartfelt, the wholehearted. This is the attitude with which we worship. And why do we worship with reverence and awe and thankfully? Why don't you underline the why? What does it say about God? Okay, we worship him acceptably, but why? Because God is a consuming fire. So underline that. We don't think of that very often because that's kind of a scary thought, maybe even terrifying. And some of the unacceptable worship we're going to be looking at, we will see that God is literally a consuming fire. And if that doesn't produce some reverence and awe, maybe we have to imagine it. Maybe we haven't seen it with our own eyes. And that doesn't make God a mean God or a God full of wrath. That just means his holiness and sin are serious business that we don't take for granted. And then, so those are the acceptable attitudes of worship. And then from last week, worship always includes sacrifice. That's from Romans 12:1 and 2. And now when we get into Adam and Eve, which is in Genesis 3, and most of us are familiar with that story, worship requires dealing with sin. Now, as soon as they sinned, how did Adam and Eve try to deal with their sin?
Right.
They were hiding from God, they were hiding really from each other, they were hiding in shame and fear. What else did they do?
They tried to cover themselves.
They tried to cover themselves. And this, I think, was more than just a bodily shame. It's kind of like the naked without shame. Now they have shame, and it's an emotional and spiritual thing. And it wasn't just to cover their nakedness, it was to cover their guilt, their shame. The fact that they had sinned. Yes, Tim?
They didn't admit to it either it was the past the buck or.
They were blaming. Yes, that was one of the first results of sin, was they blamed each other. I mean, Adam blamed the woman that you gave me, Lord, so he's kind of blaming the Lord. The woman blamed the snake, and so they didn't accept responsibility. They're trying to deal with their sin, but they dealt with it in a very inadequate way, in a substitute that was not acceptable to God. It was useless, inadequate. And so God took the initiative, as he always must. People on their own cannot deal with their own sin. You can try all kinds of things, you can try all kinds of fig leaves to cover your shame, but only God can truly cover sin. So what did God do? Look at Genesis 3, verse 21. And how would you get skins? That's right. And this is the very first time that you see sacrifice and blood, and the animals were innocent. They had not done the sin. Whether it was a sheep or a goat, it doesn't say, but animal skins obviously are going to be more durable as clothing because they would be like leather, but it's because an innocent substitute had to shed its blood. And God was teaching them a lesson that is throughout the whole Old Testament leading up to Jesus. Would someone look up Hebrews 9:22? And someone else look up Leviticus 17:11. Whoever has it first, Hebrews 9:22 or Leviticus 17:11.
And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission.
Okay, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness, no remission of sin. So God is putting a spiritual principle right from the very beginning. And Leviticus 17:11, who has that?
For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life.
Okay, life is in the blood, and it's blood that makes atonement. So God is teaching them a spiritual lesson in how to restore that relationship of worship, and it first requires dealing with sin. So that's the first blank. Worship requires dealing with sin. Second one, God takes sin seriously. This is no joking matter. This is not a time to come up with our fig leaves. Fig leaves will be inadequate and will be unacceptable to God. God takes sin seriously, and he takes the initiative too. Sin always has consequences. Sometimes they're immediate, sometimes they're short range, sometimes they are long range. And for Adam and Eve, their sin affected us. It affected thousands of years and thousands of people. Sin always has consequences, even if you think you get away with it for a while. One of the consequences was that they would die. Now, they didn't drop dead immediately, but they started to die spiritually. And later on, they did die physically too. So sin always has consequences, and sin is costly. The poor animal was innocent, but had to substitute its life in place of Adam and Eve's sin. God could have killed Adam and Eve. That would have been the end of it. That would have covered the sin, but he didn't do that. He allowed for a substitute. So if sin is costly, that means worship is costly. That's the sacrifice part of it. Now, Hebrews 12:24, I've printed out all of it, except for the blank. Without what? No one will see the Lord. Holiness. Do we really understand what holiness is? That complete purity of character, no sin whatsoever, absolute radiance as far as light, no darkness. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Whether it's Adam and Eve or whether it's us, if we want to worship the Lord, he is holy, and we need to be holy. Again, we cannot be holy on our own. Sin must be taken care of God's way. Now let's go to Cain and Abel. That's just one chapter later in Genesis 4. But I would also like someone to look up Hebrews 11:4 and 1 John 3:12 and Jude 11. I've got them written down there. So 4 scriptures, so I need 4 people to read them. Someone read from Genesis.
The Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock.
Wait, you need to back up just a little. I might have started you with the wrong verse. Chapter 4, start with verse 2.
I'm sorry, my mistake. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was cast down. When the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, you will not be accepted. But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel.
Okay. Now we see some contrast between Cain and Abel. Was it wrong for Cain to work the soil?
No.
No. That's what Adam and Eve did. Now it was harder because they were outside of the garden at this point. Was it better that Abel was more of a shepherd and kept flocks? No, not necessarily. Why did God reject Cain's offering?
Because he brought some,
Hey,
not all.
there's several opinions. I'll give you my opinion. I'm not saying it's right. We can see that he had a wrong attitude. I think we'll all agree on that. You can see the outcome. He's angry, he's downcast, he hates his brother, he's doing wrong. God warns him that sin is crouching at your door. It desires to master you, but you must master it. You have a choice. And you can see he premeditated the murder of his brother. This wasn't something that just happened casually or accidentally. This was premeditated. So he obviously had the wrong motives in worshiping God and in bringing the offering. But part of it is Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil. It doesn't say it was the best part, it was just some. And in 2 verses, there is but. That means contrast, different, okay? So Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel did something different. And Abel did something that was acceptable to God. So obviously, the some reflected a heart that was not giving the best. It was not giving the first. Whereas Abel brought not only fat portions, but from the firstborn of his flock. Now, with Cain, it was the work of his own hands, what he had accomplished, maybe what he felt good about, maybe even pride. With Abel bringing the fat portions and the firstborn, that really was the blessing of God. And he's turning it around and offering it to God. All right, let's read Hebrews 11, verse 4 and verse 6. Who has that?
By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks.
And verse 6.
And without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him.
Okay, so here's another contrast. Abel has faith. It doesn't say anything about Cain. Because there's the contrast, it's because he didn't have faith. So Abel was declared a better sacrifice. He was declared righteous. Now would someone read 1 John 3, 12 through 15. Who has that? 1 John 3, 12 through 15.
Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil, and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brother, if the world hates you.
Is that through 15?
We know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and we know that no murderer has eternal life in him.
Okay, the choices that Cain made were because of what was in his heart. His behavior resulted from his heart problem. And so it's just like when you hate your brother, that's like murdering him. Well, he followed through. But it started with hate in the heart and not love. So he didn't love his brother, and it says that he was of the devil. And that's really what God was warning him about, was that sin is crouching at your door and desires to have you. God gave him a chance to repent even right there. But again, just like Adam and Eve blaming him, trying to pass the buck kind of thing, am I my brother's keeper? You know, I mean, he didn't want to take responsibility for that sin. So we see Cain's offering and Abel's offering in contrast. Let's look at Jude 11. That's a real short verse. Short chapter of the Bible, there's not even a 1.
Both of them they have taken away from me.
Okay, so even in the New Testament, Cain is still remembered for his disobedience and his lack of faith, the first murder. And so if we talk about worship, worship must include obedience. So, yes, Tim?
I have a question while I'm sitting here as far as realizing Cain and Abel and Cain's heart. I'm trying to understand, was it natural or for him, or I'm thinking of being a young parent and how when we were younger there that, your kids will follow your examples that you set a lot of times. And I'm wondering, where is it that God has set the saying that you were to give me a sacrifice and it's supposed to be the first and holy? Where's the example at for Cain to follow?
Well, the only one that I know of that is actually written down is what we read, where God sacrificed some animals to put skins on them and shed their blood, and they were the innocent substitutes. So I think God did some explaining then. He doesn't give it all in the scriptures, and so we're kind of left to assume. That's the other theory, is that Cain did not offer a blood sacrifice. That was what God indicated as far as how to deal with sin. Now, later on, in Moses' time, when they had all the different offerings, a grain offering is perfectly acceptable. If you're going to do a thank offering, if you're going to just give something as far as a thanksgiving, that would be perfectly acceptable. So I know that he had wrong motives. We can see that from scripture. But I also think he had the wrong method. Now, I may be wrong, but I think in addition to having a heart problem, I think he wasn't following it God's way. He was doing his own thing. He wanted to bring God what he thought was best, which was the work of his own hands. So we find that worship must include obedience. And again, how is obedience related to the reverence of God? We talked about that's how we worship God acceptably. Worship must include obedience, which is the mark of our reverence of God. If we truly have reverence for God, it's not just saying, I fear the Lord or I reverence him. It's the follow through. It's your actions that prove you do have reverence for God.
I think it's a sacrifice.
It's a sacrifice.
It's a sacrifice of my time, or for me personally, it's a lot of my time,
Yep.
that it's just, for me, that's hard rather than money or something like that. It's, when you sacrifice your time to do something that you'd rather be doing something else.
Now, if God asked you to go to the mission field and you said, I'll send money, do you see the difference? If God asks you to do something, you don't come up with your own thing and say, well, I'll sacrifice something else. But if God said, just in general, I want you to help the missionaries, and you say, I'll make a sacrifice by giving, then you're doing what God has said.
And he'll let you know.
He will let you know. So that's where obedience and faith comes in. And then Kay read the verse from Hebrews 11, without faith, it is impossible to please God. So with our worship, it has to be full of faith. Our lives have to reflect that obedience. All right, so we've done the example of Cain and Abel. Now let's go to Exodus 32. This one's pretty obvious with the golden calf, but there's some subtle things in there that we might need to examine our hearts also. We might think, I never bow down to a golden calf, but there was more to it than that. So let's look at Exodus 32, 1 through 6. And again, most of these are familiar stories. Some of the later examples are a little more obscure, but we're gonna talk about unacceptable worship. Let's look at the golden calf, Exodus 32, 1 through 6. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. What basically caused their idolatry?
Boredom.
Boredom, okay? If you look back at chapter 24, when Moses first went up the mountain, verse 13, Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait there for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." Wait. And the very first verse in chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming, impatience. How many of us struggle with impatience? And we think it's no big deal. Well, sometimes the longer time goes on, the more impatient we get, and the more sin has a chance to get its foot in the door. Because impatience led to idolatry, but it was also dissatisfaction with leadership, God's appointed leadership. They wanted to do their own thing again. And there were consequences. This was one of those costly sins. This shows us the right and wrong way. They were running wild and out of control, if you read down to verse 25. So worship goes wrong when leaders don't lead and followers don't follow. And there's just that human tendency to do as we please. They wanted a God they could see, they could control, something they, yes, Pastor Wayne.
Not going into idolatry like they did, that really doesn't make any sense. When they have already been witness to the miracle working of God, and then to fashion something, whether it was out of gold or wood, it just doesn't make any sense. I've tried to figure that out a long time.
Well, I think part of it is when they were in Egypt, they were surrounded by idolatry. They had worked for centuries as slaves, carving someone else's gods. They would make statues of the Pharaoh and statues of the god. And the god Apis, A-P-I-S, was a bull or a cow that they worshipped in Egypt. And it represented fertility, it represented strength. So it's kind of like when we go to default mode. We go back to what we know. We go back to what's comfortable and safe. So idolatry comes when we're impatient. So that's the first blank. Impatience led to idolatry. The consequences were, Moses said, if you're for me and for God, come here, bring your swords, and kill everyone that is sick. And the Levites, his own tribe, gathered around him and had to do the awful job of killing people. So there was huge consequences, and you would think that would teach them. 3,000 died. God said he blotted them out of his book. He sent a plague. Now, if that's the same plague or if that's something different that God sent on them, there were severe consequences to their sin. And so the blank that we fill in kind of relates back to what we were talking about last week when we were having the gooey stuff. that the world was squeezing us into its mold and they were conforming to the world. Worldliness is the enemy of true worship. Worldliness. Did I say that right? That's a tongue twister. Worldliness is the enemy of true worship.
So how long was Moses up on the mountain, or how long was it?
40 days, that's a month and 10 days. That's a long time when you see him disappearing into a cloud and there's smoke and fire, and our God is a consuming fire. They might have thought he was dead.
Where is their faith?
Where is their faith? Like Pastor Wayne had said, they had seen God do amazing miracles. The plagues, going through the Red Sea, manna and quail already had been delivered to them miraculously, and yet throw back to Egypt and go back to the way they used to be. Remember Romans 12:2 says, no longer be conformed. They used to be conformed to the world of Egypt, but no longer should they be. All right, let's go on to Nadab and Abihu. These are a little less known. Leviticus is one of those books that people tend to avoid. Now Aaron was made the high priest, and his sons were Nadab and Abihu. He had two other sons, but in chapter 10 of Leviticus, Aaron's son, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, these were like gold, almost like an offering plate, and put fire in them and added incense. And they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke of when he said, among those who approach me, I will show myself holy in the sight of all people. I will be honored. So the sin, there's several things that aren't quite spelled out. If you look down later, God talks about the priest not drinking alcohol. And so that might have been a factor. But Nadab and Abihu were the wrong people to bring the incense. That was their father's job, the high priest's job. They also had the wrong instruments. They brought their own censers instead of the one censer of the high priest that was sanctified with a special anointing. They acted at the wrong time. This special offering was only meant for the Day of Atonement, which was one time a year, again, with just the high priest doing that. And so they were under the wrong authority. They didn't consult with Aaron, their father, or with Moses, nor did they seek the Lord's opinion through Moses. It says unauthorized or strange fire. The high priest was supposed to take the coals from the brazen altar, but they had supplied their own fire. So they've got a lot of wrong things going. They acted with the wrong motive, kind of a willful, rebellious pride. They didn't seek to glorify God or sanctify his holy name, and so they were dishonoring him. And then they depended on the wrong energy. Verses 9 and 10 imply that they might have been under the influence of alcohol. So all of these things were factors. They were just plain wrong in everything that they did. Now here's a quote from A.W. Tozer. If God were to take his Holy Spirit out of this world, much of what the church is doing would go right on, and nobody would know the difference. Ouch. Ouch. And so Nadab and Abihu were anointed priests, but that did not give them an exemption. And I think the warning in 1 Corinthians 10 says, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you too don't fall. So with Nadab and Abihu, the consequences were they were consumed with fire. Our God is a holy, consuming fire. And true worship must respect God's holiness. They had profaned God's holiness, thinking they could do it their own way. They did not respect God's holiness. All right, let's look at Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. We probably have heard of Korah, but we might not have heard of Dathan and Abiram. And that's in Numbers chapter 16. Korah happened to be a cousin of Moses, and he had responsibilities, but he wanted different responsibilities. He didn't want to do just what God wanted him to do. He wanted to do his own thing again. I don't think I'll read the whole thing, but there was a rebellion, and they became insolent and rose up against Moses, and there were other community leaders, well-known community leaders, and they formed a group to oppose Moses. And so here we see that they did not want to submit to leadership, God-appointed leadership. And so they had disobedience, they had dishonor, but it basically was rebellion against authority and leadership. And then when Moses calls them to come, they said, no, we're not even going to come. That's how rude they were and how opposed they were. They were envious and dissatisfied. They wanted what Moses had, and God had not given that to them. And the consequences were that the earth swallowed them up, including their families, wife and children, and all their possessions. Now that doesn't seem fair to us, but think of the consequences of sin that affects other people. God did not accept their worship, and he will not accept worship of those who rebel, and here's the blanks, against his orders and values. When God spells it out one way, we don't decide to do it a different way. And sometimes our hearts just get a little rebellious and we just want to do our own thing. Anybody else ever struggled with that? Okay, so Korah and his cohorts sinned. There was consequences. God did not accept their worship because it was not according to his orders and his values. And if you think this is all Old Testament and doesn't happen in the New Testament, I'll give you at least one example from Acts 5, when the church was just newly formed, right after Pentecost. Ananias and Sapphira, the disciples were all sharing things with one another. They didn't have to sell what they had to share with others. But again, it's a heart problem. And so they came in one at a time. They lied to Peter. He saw right through them. He had discernment. And he said, why are you lying to the Holy Spirit? This was their sin. And so in the blanks, unchecked hypocrisy. And isn't that what the church is often accused of? Hypocrisy, where you want to look more spiritual. And I think that was their motives, was that they wanted to look like they were generous, but they were holding some of it back. And so the other blank is deception. Hypocrisy and deception are always destructive to true worship. So if you think you're worshiping the Lord, but on the inside, God knows your heart, and it's full of hypocrisy or deceit or rebellion or any of these other sins that we talked about, God will not accept our worship. And I think Ron mentioned it, but then he knew my notes. How many times do we think of confession as part of worship? we think of praise and adoration and singing and happiness and all that. But the last blank is confession is the most neglected area of worship. But if we have sin in our heart, God won't even hear our prayers. He won't accept our worship. And if you turn in the hymn book to number 425, all of those are Bibles. Big hymn book, well, there is round or blue, page 425.